Last week, the American Association of Municipal Executives launched its free job board. That's right, it's absolutely free for you to post your senior and executive level recruitments. So if you have an assistant director position and up that you're trying to fill in your organization, go to jobs.aame.org. That's jobs.aame.org to post your listing today. Again, it's absolutely free. So if you are a city manager, county manager listening to this, if you are an HR director, please share this with your professional networks, post it out on your listservs, get the word out, because we're trying to build the only job board in the nation that is exclusively focused on senior and executive level recruitments. Again, that's jobs.aame.org. Absolutely free. Post your job today. This episode of the City Manager Unfiltered podcast is sponsored by Holbrook Asphalt. Maintaining your roads is one of the most difficult tasks for any city government. The good news is the secret to making it easier is only 3 letters. HA5. HA5 extends the life of roads and reduces the financial burden on your taxpayers. HA5 is an innovative pavement preservation treatment trusted by over 300 public agencies. It keeps good roads in good condition, reducing repair costs and saving taxpayer dollars. Join the hundreds of other cities making the smart choice. Choose HA5 for longer-lasting roads and a healthier budget. Learn more at holbrookasphalt.com/city. That's holbrookasphalt.com/city. Check the show notes for a link. All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America, and we are doing something very different today. I have a special guest with us, and we are recording in my home, in my kitchen, in Wichita. It's the first time I've ever done this. And with us today is Jeff Cantrell. He's the former city manager for the city of Hutchinson, Kansas. And Jeff, welcome to my humble abode. Welcome to the show.
Joe, thanks a lot. It's great to see you.
Man, I don't know if I ever told you this, Jeff, but when I first took the job in South Hutchinson, it was back in June of 2021-ish, and we didn't first really connect until later on towards the end of that year. I wanted to obviously meet you, interact with you. You're the big brother, right? For those who are listening on the podcast, Hutchinson's about 40,000 people. In South Hutchinson's only 2,500 people. And so I'm thinking, man, I want to meet the city manager for Hutchinson and get to know him. You know, we finally met, and you were the most gracious, accommodating person. I really appreciate just how kind and generous you were with your time. So thank you very much for that.
Likewise, I appreciated that, and meeting you was a breath of fresh air. And I know that the two cities had some history on certain items together. And for the life of me, by the time you and I got through talking about it, I never understood why those were issues.
No, we were working great. And then I guess the spoiler alert, less than a year into my tenure and just 2 years into yours, you were summarily dismissed by the city of Hutchinson. So I didn't get the chance to spend much time with you after that.
That's right. That was unfortunate. I think in our line of work, we call that an occupational hazard, but it's the reality of our work, unfortunately.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. But again, thank you so much. I was always afraid of, it's kind of intimidating because, that was only my second stop. I had only been a city administrator there. And at that point in time, literally going on my 3rd year. So I was literally just finished 2 years of being a city administrator in Sedgwick. And, here I was, this latecomer to the profession, minimal experience as far as on the administrative side of local government, and I'm in a small town, and I'm like, oh man, is this guy gonna give me the time of day? But you really did, and I appreciate it.
Well, you were a mover and a shaker, and to be honest, you were resolving issues that existed there between your city and the county for decades. And here I am watching this new guy come along and just realign pretty much everything that ever existed for the betterment of your city and its citizens, and I took notice.
Well, I ruffled some feathers. I won't get into that here, but I did piss a lot of people off. But here's the deal. When I work for a community, I go to war for that community. I go to battle for the taxpayers. I'm not a pushover, and I won't go into that here. But there's a lot of things that were going on that I felt had been pushed a little too far to the detriment of our taxpayers, our residents, and I decided to raise my voice and maybe pick a fight a little bit, and that's a conversation for another time, I guess.
Sure. You got a lot done in a short amount of time. You really did.
It was great. And so, and then, we got to work together. And then, it was really what was really crazy about you getting fired in Hutchinson is that I had a really good relationship with you, and obviously I still do. And I had a really good relationship with multiple members of the governing body there. And so it was like really,
Yes.
it really sucked for me because I'm like, oh man, I really like Jeff, and I bummed that you're going because I like, who am I going to start this new relationship with, and that whole thing. And we were just starting to really gel. And then, the other crazy part is, when you live in when you work in small town America, right? And Big Brother's literally across the river, so we could throw a rock and hit Hutch, right?
Yes.
And those two cities are so intertwined, and you hear all the rumors, all the stories, all the what really happened, what supposedly happened. It was just a tough time to watch you go through that.
It was a tough time, I think, for all of us because we were dealing with COVID and BLM. We were dealing with that. And a lot of community.
Is that the Bureau of Land Management, Jeff?
Black Lives Matter.
Oh, okay.
And so it was a very busy time. And it took me literally 2 or 3 months to get into some of our separate buildings because of the protocols being so strict with COVID. That made it real tricky.
Yeah, you started at the height of the pandemic, right?
Walked right
middle
in.
2020, right? How about we kind of unpack this a little bit? So, you were in Chanute. Shout out to Todd Newman, who's the city manager out there.
Yeah.
Chanute, honestly, I didn't realize this until just actually probably about a year ago. Chanute is actually sneaky big with respect to its budget because it has a bunch of utilities that you run as the city manager over there, right? So what was the impetus for you to want to leave Chanute to go to Hutch? I mean, obviously Hutch is a significantly larger population-wise, but...
Yeah, we always have this mindset of forward progression and wanting to do bigger and better things as far as our career path, and I was no different. But it was pretty comfortable there, and I had it down to a science and full utilities, electric, gas, fiber, you name it. So I was at the point where I'd been there 5-6 years, pretty comfortable, and I started getting communications from a recruiter, and it was a recruiter for Hutchinson. And the first time I received it, I wasn't real interested. And 2 or 3 weeks later, he contacted me again, and I thought, you know what? I'll go out and I'll take a look at this city. Hutchinson.
Had you been to Hutchinson before? Because it's for the audience, he was working in southeast Kansas, and Hutchinson is in central Kansas, essentially. So I was wondering, how much time had you spent in Hutchinson?
It'd been a long time, and really the most thing that I was familiar with was their airport operations because I used to have an airplane or two, and we would fly out for the so-called $100 cheeseburger at the airport and get a load of fuel while we were there. And so I at least knew that Hutchinson existed.
The burger wasn't $100. It was the gas to get there, right?
That's right. That's right. So I had familiarity with the city. And, of course, working my whole career in Kansas, knew of Hutchinson and, the location of the annual state fair and whatnot. Yeah. So I was pretty familiar with it.
What's Chanute's population?
Chanute is right at 10,000.
Okay, and Hutch is at 40,000.
That's right.
And the thing too for those for the audience is that Hutch is roughly the 10th or 11th largest city in Kansas. We don't really have many large cities, and most of them are located up in the Kansas City metro area.
That's right.
But the city of Wichita is the largest city in Kansas. But
yeah, Wichita, big city.
Yeah,
for sure.
So you got recruited by the recruiter to look at it, and you said, "Hey, I think I want to do this."
Yeah,
I think they were struggling to find at some point, right? I want to throw anybody under the bus. I don't know, but I think they were having some trouble at some point getting a city manager to go there. John Deerdoff, who had been there for a legend, like 17 some years, right?
That's right.
That's tough to go into a spot where someone's been there for nearly 20 years.
It was, and John had formed so many vital relationships within that city that had stood the test of time, I think, for John. And ironically, John was the recruiter at the same time. His city allowed him to do that. And he felt that my disposition and my management style most closely matched his and would probably gel pretty well with his governing body. And I took great comfort in knowing that, spent a lot of hours watching the videos of the meetings like we all do, looking up old, issues that the city has to deal with and understanding what their liabilities are. just like anybody would do. It's interesting because the group that always hires you, I always had a rule. If you're not hired unanimously by the governing body, start looking somewhere else, because that's just latent trouble waiting to bite you when you least expect it. And so, much to my surprise and chagrin, I was unanimously selected, and I thought that probably meant that we had a good 3 to 5 years of solid working period to get things accomplished. And there was probably more political instability than I realized, and then there was a significant changeover in the governing body shortly thereafter, which, when you're hired and they give you, we all commonly refer to it as a hit list, but here's a list of things that have been bothering us for 15 years. We'd like you to straighten those out in the first year if you can. And they relate with external agencies, the county. We want to reformulate these contracts. We want to save money. We're paying too much for this. Go get them.
Yeah.
And so that was the message that was very clear to me when I was hired. And so I set out to do that.
You were given marching orders to go fix some things.
That's exactly right.
And then did you feel like when you went down that road to start fixing things that you were supported in that endeavor, or?
It was tricky business, and I knew that it would be. I knew that I had to be cautious how I approached that from prior experience that we've all learned the hard way. So I knew that there was an essence of timing to it, and there was going to have to be a finesse to it to make it survivable. And one thing that's just simply not survivable is when you're cutting funds to an agency that a future council member's wife works for. And, that hits home. That's personal.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it at the time, but by the time I had new elected officials sworn into office, I realized what had taken place there. And that really cut short the lifespan of my career path there at that particular city.
Yeah, it's amazing how you can hit a landmine and not even know it sometimes.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
For sure.
Shout out to my council in South Hutchinson because, when I got there, we kind of alluded to at the beginning of this interview, and I went to battle with the county over a bridge issue. And to my council's credit, we had a significant conversation. I was very over communicative with some memos and some other stuff. And I said, hey, this is what I want to do. Do you want to give me the marching orders? And they gave me the marching orders, and we started going to battle. And they backed my play. It got pretty hot and it got pretty heated. It got pretty hot and heavy at some point. And then we kind of had to dial down the pressure. But everyone it walked away as a win. But my council was just so amazing in that regard in terms of supporting me, and that's something I've always been, in both my stints in Sedgwick and South Hutchinson, I had a tremendous experience with my governing body, just supporting me and backing me up. So that was really a wonderful experience.
That is so important, and I knew that you were making things happen, Joe. When I went home, turned on the 10 o'clock news, and there was my buddy Joe. And I think you were at the top of the hour too. It was the battle between your city and the county, and so I tuned in, turned the volume up a little bit, and listened to the issue on it. And it related to a bridge and something that seemed to be kind of an injustice to your small city for a long time, and you resolved it. And I was not the only one in my organization that was impressed that you pulled that off to the degree that you did. I'm sure you had to feel some heat on that, but you got it done.
Man, this is the Unfiltered podcast. There's things I want to say and talk about, but I don't really, it's bygones be bygones,
That's right.
I will say this. Because it does come back to your situation and it relates to it, is when I walked into that position in South Hutchinson, and I'm there my first month, and I'm looking at this situation, and I can let it pass. I can just sort of put my head down and bury it and be like, hey, this is all predates me. I don't need to run the risk of alienating myself with anybody in the county. I mean, I didn't know anybody in that county. I barely knew anybody in Kansas, period. I'd only been here for a couple of years.
Right.
And so the risk to me was significant, on a personal, professional level, right? Because I had nothing to really gain by doing that. But it was my pure loyalty to the taxpayers and what I thought was need to be done in South Hutch. That's why I went to such great lengths. And I I pissed some people off, to be frank, and what have you. So, but I took that risk because I thought that was the right thing to do, and I sort of pride myself on doing what I think is the right thing to do, for better or worse. And so it's frustrating when I look at your situation and when you obviously given your side of the story, we've talked over the years, and you walk into a situation in Hutchinson where it's the middle of the pandemic, which you're already getting off to a terrible start because you don't really get a honeymoon period at that point, right?
That's right.
Because you don't get a chance to really meet people, interact with people, all these different, you do in theory, right? But everyone knows that clock, it runs. Like the reality is like, yeah, there's all these things that are legitimate excuses like a pandemic, right? Yep. But at some point, no one really cares anymore. You know what I mean? Right. And you're just sort of that guy that no one really got to know.
That's right. We manage so many things by Zoom. I think on average we did 8 or 10 Zooms a day. So it was literally months before I was able to meet some of the key staff members of the city other than via Zoom.
Yeah.
We were fumigating trucks, to kill the COVID virus. We were, everyone was masked up. We had a policy that was not very popular at the time, but it was supported, I think, by the governing body for everyone to have the COVID antivirus.
Yeah, the vaccine.
The vaccine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was kind of a hostile situation just environmentally.
Yeah.
Just because of that, and that we spent a lot of time on that.
Sure and then you just own the natural differences of following somebody who's been there for 17 years and they have a different style, a different personality, a different relationship with those folks. It's tough. You really didn't get a fair shake, in my opinion, on that. So.
I appreciate that. I figured coming into town that accepting the job would come with a significant risk. But I thought, honestly, it was one that I could outpace and outlive, and I've always felt that way, and it's an arrogance that a lot of us managers have when we jump into a position because we feel that one of our strengths relates to our social skills and our ability to build relationships and teams, and I thought that I could outpace that. And for the first time in my nearly 30-year career, I was wrong on that, and realized that it was going to be a short lifespan as far as the job went. But what was most unfortunate is that, when you want to uproot yourself and you change your job and you go somewhere else, you're not just loading a few boxes of your own clothes. You're taking your kid along. Maybe you've got a spouse, but, you're going to be dealing with that too. Maybe they have to find employment to make your numbers tick based on your quality of life that you're accustomed to. And my case was a little different, but I definitely introduced my son to a new school district. He had to go through the pains and efforts of that. High school, no less.
You and I had a commonality because I moved out to Kansas from California after my son had finished his 9th grade freshman year in high school. I was not very popular in my household, I will tell you that.
Culture shock for sure.
I was not popular. No, my son was not happy. He got to vote. We were a mile and a half from the beach, and now we're in the middle of Kansas, and he was not happy with me.
I bet that's right.
Yeah, and but to hammer that point home, you uprooted your family to come from Chanute, to Hutch, and you barely last 2 years. So your kid hasn't even finished high school yet. As we're talking, he's finishing up this year, right?
That's right. Yeah. Got a semester to go.
So Jeff, I remember you're going through this whole situation because it surprised me when I first heard about you possibly not having your contract renewed, and I wasn't even posting on LinkedIn at this time, and you weren't terminated technically speaking. Your contract was simply not renewed, but this was the first time perhaps in your career that you were maybe unwanted or cast aside by an employer. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's correct. Yeah.
How did that feel?
I didn't anticipate that, and I chalked some of that up to arrogance and maybe some of my historic preference and awards that I had won from previous employers. I had an excellent reputation within the state, and so it caught me by surprise. But at the same time, I recognize that we have to live and die by the politics that employ us. And at the end of the day, there's little we can do or say about that unless we adjudicate it or we find that there's been a violation in the way that it was handled. And unfortunately, that did arise. We were able to reach a settlement with the city later on for a sizable amount of money for, I think I'm at liberty to say that it was a deprivement of my constitutional rights in the way that was done. Now, what they could have done, they could have said, we're going to non-renew you because we don't like the color of your tennis shoes, or you drive a car that we don't like. Just pick something abstract that doesn't matter, because any of those would have worked. But instead, it was implicated that my age was a factor in my separation. Now, I don't mind telling the audience that I'm only 53 years of age. I've got a son that's...
Well, now you are.
Right. That's right. Now
this is like 3 years ago. Yeah.
So I was 50 at the time. And I did have the support of one council member who was a real strong supporter of the work that we had done and gotten accomplished. And she did everything that she could to right the ship, but it was just too little too late. And of those organizations that were going to be trimmed financially, the impact to them became so disruptive to the politics of the city that it seemed that social media almost took over. A lot of actions were taken based upon those efforts that were made by the city. Now, I believe we left the city in a much better place than it was prior, certainly like you did with your city. But unfortunately, that comes with blood on our hands when we depart.
Yeah, I don't know the ins and outs of Hutch and everything else, and I was so head down and focusing on my city that I didn't even know much about. And I'm new, right? I didn't have a chance even. I'm still learning my city, let alone try to figure out what's going on with the city next door, right? Even though there's that interrelated connectedness, and then you have the other layer of the county too. And geographically speaking, for the audience, Hutch and South Hutch are literally right next to each other, and then literally the county is located within the city limits of Hutch. So it's like
that's right.
And the county itself, that's where probably 80% of the population or more of the county lives in that region of the county. So what's interesting about this whole thing is that a lot of cities, they get into this, I don't know if it's a trap is the right word, but they get into these relationships or these agreements where they're funding nonprofits and all these different stakeholder groups. And then it goes from being we're trying to help you out and help you with your mission to then it becomes an entitlement program, right? Where they can never take that back, right? You're just expected, and I'm not speaking ill of anything in Hutch right now. I'm just speaking in a generic macro sense, but you got the chamber over here wants to get funding, right? You got all these different social programs or social organizations over here that are getting funding. You got just little mom and pop nonprofits that might be doing the Lord's work, right? They might be doing great work, but the government gets involved in handing out these funding sources. And so then when the city or the county or whatever the organization is needs to sort of dial it back, it can be very politically dangerous to do so.
It is. It really is. Very destabilizing. You learn real quick who's affiliated with what mission that you might be affecting, and that drives the political ire of quite a few people, and so much so that it caused a few of them to run for office. Successfully.
Yeah.
And when you find yourself on the backside of that power curve, as the guy that came in 2 years' time made substantial changes financially for the city at the expense of other outside organizations. Stand back, get ready.
Yeah. One and the other layer of complexity too that I didn't fully appreciate till I started this career in Kansas is, and Hutch is generally speaking a small town. I know it's 40,000 people. It's large by Kansas standards, but it's a small town. And I've worked in small towns that are Sedgwick and South Hutch are even smaller. Is there's so many tentacles and degrees of connections and separations. Like you have no idea who is impacted by what, who knows who. It's like you constantly have to have your head in a swivel and be very careful because you don't know if you pull the lever here, what's going to fall out of the machine over here. It's an interesting dynamic working in a small town or a small region.
It is. And so many of us in this profession, we want to be true to ourselves and to the mission so that we're not handicapped by that element. But the reality is the lifespan of our career there certainly is directly related to that. And so I think in some cases where you have very short tenures of managers, you might be able to look back in history and see that that's where some of the most impactful changes were made and some of the battles fought. I think that's probably realistic.
Yeah. Well, logic dictates that the more you're going to upset the apple cart, higher probability of a short tenure, right? Because
That's right.
There's just the Venn diagram of pissing people off. Those circles start to overlap, and it just becomes too big, right?
When they're picketing your office window on the sidewalk, you know that you've got some issues to address. And, those are always segmented elements of the population. And so you assume you can survive that. I've had petition drives before, on rental licensing and things like that. And so I was not completely uncomfortable with that, but the timing, it just seemed like the timing had something to do nationally with the discord of certain segmented groups and local government. It really seemed to add an extra flavor to that experience that in the prior 25 years, I had never seen anything quite like that.
Yeah.
And I've worked for bigger cities than Hutch and had experienced that, decades ago. But in this particular case, it was unique, and it seemed to be unique to the timing of the nation as well.
I want to circle back a little bit to earlier in the conversation when you talked about maybe your arrogance or whatnot might have kind of blinded you to the impending realities of your situation and coming to a short tenure. Something that I try to convey either on this podcast or on my LinkedIn post from time to time is, and again, not that you were fired, but let's just call it the equivalent of being fired for the sake of this conversation of not having your contract renewed.
Sure.
Is it can be emotionally debilitating and destabilizing to go through something like that. Because historically speaking, right, if you're a city manager, you make it to the top of your profession by title. Generally speaking, those individuals have been successful in almost their entire life through those endeavors, right? They've probably been very good at school. They've got, gone to college. They've excelled in department head land, all that other stuff, right? And so when you go through your first situation or your first termination or your first sort of cast aside, not feeling like you're wanted or loved anymore, I think that can be really jarring for the individual. I guess, how have you processed that over the last 3 years since you were cast aside, so to speak?
Boy, that's a great question. I took time to focus on a few things that I knew I had deprived in my life prior to that, because as you well know, it's not just a 9-to-5 job. We're on 24/7. And so I dedicated time to some of those other interests. I addressed a few health issues that I'd been putting off, and I'm glad that I did, because one of them was potentially pretty harmful to my existence, but we've got that resolved now. So I feel like I'm a new man, but I do have a new mindset, and it's one where an old friend of mine told me this one time: look at yourself as though you put your fist in a bucket of water. Pull your fist out of that bucket of water and tell me if you've ever been there. And I guess it's a good, solid reminder for me to not get too far ahead of ourselves when it comes to wanting to make change in a community that we might be new to, because there's a lot of people that have lived there for generations, and they already have an idea as to where they want that community to go. And from a business perspective, it might not make any sense at all. But from another perspective, it's something that you definitely have to pay attention to. And I think in that regard, it's probably slowed my roll a little bit, and I will probably have more of a tendency to reach back and see how close my governing body is following me and supporting me in certain actions in the future. That is just absolutely important. It's vital. Otherwise, I think what's going to happen is the industry or our profession is just going to earn the reputation of being hatchet men, and we come in and make the change, and then we're terminated, and we collect our severance, and we go on down the road. And I think the profession deserves more than that. It's there's a reason for our profession, and I think it's important that it gets communicated well with your governing body, and that there's probably a better understanding of where you stand with your governing body other than maybe an annual evaluation. I always welcomed open door conversations with my elected officials just to kind of see where we're at and what their current issues might be, to make sure that we've got our finger on the pulse. And I think it changed me in that way. I'll probably reach back a little bit more often just to see who's following me and who's still on the same page.
Is it fair to say you felt like you were blindsided by this situation?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Blindsided in the fact that everything accomplished was exactly what I was hired to do. One of the council members made a pretty outstanding statement on the record, and it still stands. And she was dead right. We had accomplished everything that I was hired to do. But what had failed was I don't think anybody completely realized what the external effect would be of adjusting those outside organizations and how many emotions went along with that. In my world where I grew up, your core services ruled the day.
Yeah.
Sewer, water, snow removal, you name it.
We're talking about that now in LA, right? With the wake of the wildfire.
Absolutely right. And so I think as we get into bigger cities and more complex situations, we find that we might be talking about an adjustment in funding for the zoo. Well, that means that an exhibit might not come to fruition in this next year like was programmed to happen. You'd be amazed how many people that ticks off. And for a guy that's more concerned about aged infrastructure under the ground or maybe gas pipeline issues and whatnot, I probably didn't give adequate concern to issues like the spotted owl. But I think in the future going forward, I'll probably have a better barometer on that.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, that's the kind of a nice segue into one of the real reasons I wanted to have you on this podcast, because as you know, I've sort of cut my teeth and built a reputation on talking about city manager contracts and salaries and compensation. And you were blindsided by this. And one reason you were blindsided, in my opinion, I think you'll agree, obviously, so we talked about this, is that you kind of really dropped the ball when it came to the contract that you negotiated and agreed to with this governing body. Is that fair to say?
I had such a comfort level with this group during what was really a pretty extensive interview process. So I felt like I got to know some of these individuals personally, and I still believe that I did. But the change that can happen so quickly when new individuals come into office, that can be extremely disruptive. But you're right. I was lulled into a sense of comfort. And instead of, like the city that I came from, I had a 1-year severance. And there were times where that saved me and allowed me to get through some turbulence that I otherwise wouldn't have survived. Well, in this case, it wasn't a 1-year severance. It was a 6-month, and it was conditioned upon not receiving certain misdemeanors even. A lot of cities, of course, will put felony language in. You don't want to hire a felon for a city manager, obviously. But there was some language in there that related to misdemeanor actions even. Well, you get a speeding ticket that can rise to the level of a misdemeanor.
But one of the big things, or the biggest thing that I didn't like about your contract, was the fact that you did not have a notification requirement, meaning that the council, there were two aspects of it. One is you signed a 1-year contract when you got to Hutchinson, and in that contract there was no notification requirement giving you any heads up notice that they weren't going to renew it. So you basically didn't find out that your contract wasn't getting renewed until basically the week of, correct?
That's right. And I knew that going in, but what the contract also had, and it was a weak provision, but it did have a provision for the right to cure. And so if I was non-renewed, I then had the ability to go into executive session and discuss with the governing body what the elements were of the non-renewal, or perhaps we could negotiate past it and make some changes. And I made a formal plea per the contract to actually, have that meeting, and I was denied that meeting, which then it became pretty obvious that there was, a motive and an intent to maybe go around some of the contractual language and make a change.
Did that factor at all into the lawsuit that you filed in the settlement, or was that completely separate and distinct from that?
It bolstered my position from the aspect of their motive and their intent.
Okay.
Yes, it was helpful. Well, it was not fun that I wasn't allowed the right to cure, but in the end, it helped paint the overall story that the issue was mishandled completely.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So, you moved from Chanute to Hutch to take this position, and the big thing that I wanted to point out was, again, they were firm on a 1-year requirement or a 1-year term length, and they had a residence requirement, right? So you're uprooting your family, and you have to buy a house inside the city, right? Well, you don't have to buy a house; you could rent theoretically, right? But you buy a house inside the city, right? Because we want the city manager to be invested, right? To be a part of the community, here for the long haul, right? Because you're going to be here for the next, the next 17. You're going to be our next John here for the next 17 years, right?
If you're going to recommend a tax increase, you're going to pay part of it while you live here.
That whole argument, right?
Absolutely.
It's so one-sided though when the city manager gets fired, right? So you agreed to this contract that's only 1 year in length without a notification requirement that they're not going to renew. So you get left holding the bag on the second year. So your first year you got renewed, and they just extended it 1 year.
Right.
And you get shown the door.
Yes.
And your kid is in 10th grade at that point, I guess, or something. Or
that's right.
Whatever. And now you have to face this decision. What do I do now? Do I try to get another job someplace that's going to, and you're going to have to relocate because there's no other job that's even comparable to what you're doing anywhere nearby. Yeah. So you're going to have to uproot your family, relocate, and put your kid in another school again in high school, the third high school. That's not a very fun idea or proposition, is it?
It's not. It's, I think it's probably one of the biggest disadvantages to our profession is the fact that I've always called it the 500-mile rule. Whenever you get uprooted and you're ready to make the change, or someone's going to make the change for you, you need to think in increments of 500 miles at a time, because you're probably not going to go right next door, because there's interrelationships that exist, and nobody wants to hire the neighbor's guy that they just terminated or separated with.
Yeah.
So that definitely comes into play.
So you've been sort of licking the wounds a little bit, maybe more. When I say licking the wounds, looking maybe psychologically, emotionally, going through the trauma of having that, being cast aside, we talked about, and you've had to navigate, getting your kid to the finish line of high school, graduating this year, right?
That's right.
And so you've kind of had to take it on the chin financially, because it's not like you can find another city manager job when you're living in Hutch, right?
Absolutely right.
And by the way, psychologically, we haven't talked about this either. Is it a kick in the nuts to live in the city that you felt like just sort of like kicked you in the nuts and cast you aside, and you like every day you gotta see sort of like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's
like seeing your ex every day.
Part of it's freeing, and for instance, the recent weather event that we had, 8 or 10 inches of snow, which I know compared to other parts of the world is nothing, but you're looking at things and wondering if maybe you wouldn't have done it different if you were at the helm. But I've got a great deal of respect for the employees, and in our line of work, I think that's what sucks the most is when you do transition out, even when it's on your own terms, you're leaving behind some quality people that really want to do good for the city. And I'm talking about guys in the water department that literally saved lives. There was a guy that had a heart attack in his yard, and he was laying down, and most people just kept driving by because they thought that he was trying to turn on a water valve. And it turns out that the guy was gravely ill. And so some of the guys from the water crew actually saved that gentleman. So you're talking about some real quality people. I know your city has them too.
Yeah, salt of the earth, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's the family issue, leaving behind those excellent people. That's tough sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right. You get stuck with the house. You buy at the height of the market.
What's your interest rate?
My gosh, Joe, I think the hell of it was, you don't typically buy a house when
Thinking you're going to sell it in 2 years?
Yeah, when you're in a 2-year predicament. I think they suggest in the books that we studied that that's probably a 4 to 5 year window. Otherwise, you rent.
Yeah, I think it's actually around 7 years. You probably, if you're going to be there for less than 7 years, you're not supposed to really buy. But that's tough to do.
It is. It is.
It's tough to be a renter.
It really is. Yeah. Because you're wanting to provide certain things for your family, certain attributes of the neighborhood. And
there's also an image that goes with it. There's sort of, right? And I think most city managers want to be invested. They want to feel like they're invested in their community to a degree, right? And
that's right.
And obviously when you live there, and that's the thing, kind of goes back to what we said earlier in the conversation where, you've never been cast aside before. You've never really had that experience. So for you, you had no inclination or even thought that this was going to end in a negative. You know what I mean? It's like the classic. It's the classic conversation about prenuptial agreements, right? It's like, oh, we're planning on getting a divorce ahead of time. Like, we're not going to get divorced.
No one ever
right?
plans on a divorce when you're saying your vows. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think what is really confusing, probably the most not confusing. I'm an adult. I'd like to think of myself as being somewhat educated here, but what is frustrating is when you're being basically served your walking papers and they're telling you, along with the public in a public forum, a council meeting, that you're doing a good job, you've done everything you were hired to do, and you check all the boxes for sure as far as what the city manager is supposed to do and their responsibilities. And then they call for the vote, and it's a 4-1. And that's frustrating.
I know from talking to you afterwards that 4-1 vote really kind of rocked you a little bit, right?
It did. I thought it may be a split vote. I'm thinking 3-2 at worst.
Yeah.
So I wasn't packing boxes already. I figured I'd survive it at least for another. And we're also kind of trained to realize that if you get a 3-2 vote or a split vote, you know that it might be time to start making some changes internally, or maybe start looking at other opportunities, because you don't want to be caught flat-footed in that scenario, because everybody suffers when that happens. Even the community suffers when that happens. Yeah. So,
and that goes back to again, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast is a learning experience for our peers is, if you're going to be on a contract that has a term length, I know a lot of people subscribe to the desire of wanting to have that evergreen contract, and I have some thoughts on that too, but I think you can actually have a term contract that's actually set up to be in your favor because of some solid notification requirements, for example. But if you'd had that in place, you would have had that heads up like, oh, okay, things are a little bit rocky here. Because obviously if it had been 6 months heads up that they're not going to renew your contract, then you could start making preparations for not only a succession planning, right, for with the staff. Because when you basically got clipped, it wasn't like
no plan in place at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
It was exit stage left.
And then they have to, get an interim in, and then, and then they have to do the search and recruitment and everything else. And it's interesting. The Kendall Francis followed you, and he only had a 1-year contract. We talked about his contract, him and I, before he agreed to sign it. And I had some concerns about that 1-year deal. And there was I think the city attorney's philosophy is, from what I understand, is believe that you can only do a 1-year contract. And then I lit up Baker Tilly, who was doing the recruitment before they got Enrico Villegas in there. Talked about how they weren't sharing with the candidates the fact that the city was hardcore about a 1-year term. That makes no sense for you. Yeah. It makes no sense for candidates to be completely unaware of the fact that they're applying for a job that they're going to have to relocate to, and the city wants you to they have a residence requirement, and yet they're only going to commit to you for a 1-year term. Like that makes no sense. But I am excited to report that Enrico's contract was more than a year. He basically, it goes to the end of 2026. So that was a little bit of a change.
That will provide some stability. Yeah. And honestly, if a manager's doing a horrible job, there's elements for cause, that can easily be put into a contract where elements for performance and cause can come into play. And you can resolve that issue that way. But yeah, if you can't provide stability for the family of your city manager when he comes on board, it's kind of foolish to think that he's going to give you his all 24/7 when it hits the fan.
And you say that, and that's a pet peeve of mine too. All these contracts, yours included, most of these contracts, they'll say, hey, if you're the city manager, you're not allowed to have any outside employment or do anything else unless you have the permission of the governing body, right?
That's right.
And I can't stand that. And, interestingly enough, I talked to John Deardoff a little yesterday, unrelated to this podcast conversation. He's an avid golfer, right?
Absolutely.
And
a good one.
And I'm not trying to throw him under the bus at all when I say this at all. I'll make it very clear. But John and any other city manager out there, they don't need to get permission to go to the golf course and shoot a couple rounds a week, right? They don't need to get permission to do X, Y, and Z over here. So why the hell do we give governing bodies the ability to control what we can do when it comes to our additional outside employment or things like that? I don't like that because it gets back to what you just said a minute ago. If you do not perform, right, and obviously I'm not talking about conflicts of interest. Obviously, that's got to be prohibited, and any city manager worth their salt who's got good ethics is going to avoid those conflicts of interest. Yeah. But if you're not doing your job, then the governing body is going to get rid of you, right? So
absolutely.
So it's like if you're spending too much time being an adjunct professor and not enough time doing city manager stuff, you're gonna pay the consequence. But I don't know why we got to. The idea that we got to go hat in hand and ask for permission from daddy just so we can go out and do a side hustle or whatever. I'm just not a fan of that.
I had to seek permission from a prior city because they had that same proviso to occasionally teach evening courses at KU.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow. And these were public management courses. And I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting. Nobody gave me any friction over it, and of course it was approved.
And most of the times it doesn't, but I guarantee, I've had a city manager reach out to me and talked about their contract was a little outdated, and that they were technically in violation because they had taken an adjunct professor role without paying attention. And it was like, hey, realistically, if I was crossways with my counsel, if I did something to piss them off, and they could have fired me for cause on that right there.
Could have clipped you.
Sure. I mean, and it was just like a complete, whiff, right? Complete, didn't even think about it. This person had been there for quite a few years as a city manager. Everything was good. But, that's the other thing. When you're a city manager for a long time in a certain spot, you can kind of get a little bit comfortable and forget what your contract even says, right?
That's right.
So anyway, enough of my little rants, but that's one of them.
Well, you're dead on. That's an excellent point for anybody that's considering or already in the midst of our line of work, looking to climb the ladder and get promoted. Absolutely right.
So what's on tap for you now, Jeff? You and I, we've talked over the years. We've stayed in contact. And I check in with you regularly to see, if you're in the job market. You've been, like, hey, Joe, I'm raising my son. I got some elderly parents I got to tend to, right?
Right,
I mean, you can't move. You've been anchored to Hutch, right? So unless you're going to go into a private sector or do something, you have very limited opportunities for the time being. What's on tap for you now? Do you think you're going to get back into the game?
I think there will come a time that's rapidly approaching where I have renewed interest in doing the same work, but perhaps in a slightly different political environment. It's one of those things where you kind of pick your poison. If you're in a socioeconomic community that's suffering, you don't always get the resources that you need, but you can affect change. And for me, that change is rewarding. I like seeing that kind of change. It's the most rewarding thing I've ever experienced. And I've worked for cities that, I think it was the top 10 wealthiest cities in the nation, a suburb of Johnson County, Kansas. And I loved the work. It was a great city, great folks, but sometimes the biggest issue of the year was what piece of public art was received and where it was placed.
First world problems, right?
Yeah. And there was so much satisfaction from the public that nobody would even show up at, budget hearings. Yeah. Well, I'd like to have a little more interaction than that. And I'd like to be in a community where you can actually affect change in the real quality of people's lives. And I think for me, what that means is I'm going to have to get rid of this mindset of every jump that I make, I quadruple my population and I double my salary. I'm pulling my horns in, and I find more now than ever that I want to make a difference at that core level.
Yeah.
That's important to me. You lose focus of that.
Do you feel like the larger the organization you get in, the more difficult that is to accomplish that?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah, I have a whole new respect for cities that have populations, let's say, 25,000 or less. Yeah, it's more in your face when things are going south, but at the same time, that is a venue where you can energize volunteers, local boosters. You can affect change a little bit quicker. It's an easier way to move the needle, in my experience.
Yeah, that's I've talked about that before. That's one of the things I love most about this profession is the ability to put your thumb on the scale and make a difference. And the feedback loop is so almost immediate, right? In terms of what you can do. And one of the things that I've shared is that I've never had the highs that I've received working in a small community and being able to bring significant change, and the funny part is most of the residents don't even really fully know that you are involved in that change making as the change making agent, right?
Right.
But the ability to do that has been, the highs, I haven't never been able to get those anywhere else. And that's what's really fun. And, you and I are kind of on a different sort of trajectory in the sense that if I go back in the public sector, I have this ego issue that I've been trying to wrestle with of do I want to go to a larger city? Because it's sort of like, you and I were talking baseball before the podcast, Bob Uecker, who just passed away. And but there's this, I always have this gnawing sort of question I ask myself, like, can I handle the fastball? Can I handle a major league fastball and be a, big time, big city manager?
Right.
And I think I can. And I'm pretty confident that I could, but I haven't yet. You know what I mean? And so there's that ego issue I think about. It's like, do I need to check that box? And to what end? Is it to make the ego happy, or am I really going to get the enjoyment and satisfaction out of being in a larger city? Because when I talk to a lot of the larger city managers, it's constantly, hey, you're going from one meeting to the next. There's very little, boots on the ground engagement and problem solving because everything's being delegated, and you're just trying to make sure you're like an air traffic controller, right? Since you're a pilot, you're trying to make sure all the planes are getting lined up and everything's going the way it's supposed to go. But are you really rolling your sleeves up and putting the work in?
That's absolutely right. I've seen that time and time again with colleagues, and it does seem to take an element of the joy out of it. And, what I noticed, Joe, when you came on, everyone was a little bit scared of you at first, I think, because you came in with a business acumen that, frankly, it's not really taught. I mean, you've got responsiveness versus efficiency. They teach you when you're getting your master's degree. And I think we've all accepted the fact that we're just going to operate inefficiently, but we're going to be responsive, and we're going to plug the holes that need to be plugged. And you had an approach that was very refreshing because of your business background and your understanding of that. And if it didn't make sense financially, I noticed that that's something that you weren't highly supportive of. And I'm not talking about sewers or overhead power lines. Obviously, those aren't always money makers the first 20 years. But I think that allows you to be extremely unique going into some of these municipalities and counties that have been suffering for decades financially. Yeah. And everything's been a political decision, and nowadays more dangerous than ever, social media. You get the 5%ers that are out there driving social media narratives, and you find that that's where the money goes, but it has absolutely no correlation with what the true needs of the city are. And then worse than that, you find out that maybe a third of the people lobbying for that don't even live within your taxing jurisdiction.
I know.
I could just scream.
I know.
But that's just the way of the world today.
Absolutely. So Jeff, let's kind of segue away from your own personal experience and kind of use sort of the history or of your experience to maybe impart some lessons to those who are coming up behind us, right? What are your thoughts? And now you're in your 50s. You've been in this business for a long time. You have fewer good years in front of you than you do behind you, right? When it comes to working, anyway.
I love you, brother. That's right.
Hey, I'm right behind you. I'm only 6 years behind you or so.
Keeping it real.
You have any thoughts or things you'd like to share to the next generation of leaders that are coming up?
I do. The future's definitely in their hands, and I hope and I know that what you're doing is helping them out, Joe. And the blood and tears that I've shed over the years hopefully can be avoided by others. And just some notes that I put down before I arrived at your home. Beautiful home, by the way. Don't ever accept a job unless it's a unanimous vote from the governing body. That would be my personal advice, because you're going to be dealing with that forever.
It's an uphill battle. It's just an uphill battle, right?
It is. Yeah. And it has the propensity to gain traction against you when you least need it.
Let me ask you something on that point, because I've made this argument, and the frustrating thing about being on LinkedIn is I can make comments and posts, but I don't always get the feedback because a lot of people don't necessarily want to engage. Although that's changing, honestly, in the last 2 and a half years I've been on. We're starting to see a little bit more of a robust discussion and debate within our community in terms of our peers on public, as far as the social media pages. Yeah. But I have a question for you. Do you think it is easier for a governing body member who supported you to turn on you, or for a governing body member who opposed you to then become your supporter or advocate? Do you have any thoughts on which one's easier with human nature and everything else? It's kind of speaking to that unanimous vote of the governing body when they're hiring you versus, say, a split vote.
I think in my past, I've noticed that I have been able to resurrect those relations or reservations that those elected officials might have had towards me when I was initially hired. So I think in my track record, I've probably done pretty well at maintaining positive relationships, but I think some of my more valuable relationships have been created from people that were, maybe I misread them, but they seemed to be somewhat critical in the beginning.
Yeah.
And for those people, I always promise that I maintain an open door policy, and I'll treat them the same as any other elected official, and nobody gets any special favors that's not orchestrated under the charter of the city.
Yeah, yeah. I've always felt that the relationships where you butt heads with somebody and you have some sort of meeting of the minds are usually the most interesting or best relationships, the strongest ones that you have, I think kind of going back, kind of going back to when we were kids. I remember getting to a couple of some brawls with some fellas, and then all of a sudden
they're your buds.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. But I was speaking more to the point when I look at human nature and just the human condition. It seems to me, and this is one of the reasons why I'm on your train as far as supporting or only wanting to be involved with a unanimous vote, is I think it's easier for someone to turn on you and go from being a fan to a hater than it is to get a hater to become a fan. Now, it can happen, but I just feel like it's easier for someone to be against you. So I always feel like if you're going in on a 3-2 vote or a 4-1 vote, it's much easier and much more likely that you're going to lose support than you're going to gain support. And I just think there's so many, and not only do I think that's a human nature type thing, but I think it's because all these other parameters and factors and external conditions that can shape it up. And then, you touched on it just a minute ago, just a social media sewer now where everything can just be beat you over the head, you know? And I think the thing that a lot of people don't really fully process or understand is all the stuff that's being said on social media could be completely wrong, could be a complete lie, all that other stuff.
Yeah.
But it just becomes an accumulation factor that you just can't outrun it or get away from it. And it just becomes one of those deals where, hey, even if it's all BS, the slate just has to be wiped clean, right?
It's
and
easier.
Just start anew again.
It's easier for elected officials to do it that way.
And so the chaos agents, right, the social media terrorists, which I've professed to be one, I've admitted that I used to be in that game, they have this innate built-in advantage because they already have the scale tipped. You know what I mean? It's like betting on a game and already given a touchdown to start. You know what I mean?
That's right.
It's because they don't have to play fair. They don't have to win you on merit. They don't have to beat you on merit. They can just wear you down and wear down your bosses, right?
Yeah.
And if you have council members who are getting tired of being beat up,
what choice do they have, right? What's the easiest choice, I guess?
Well, yeah. I mean, honestly,
right?
I mean, and pay 6 months, or it's funny, and I you talked about before about having that 1 year severance saved you, and I meant to come back to that in the conversation, but I forgot because I had a story in South Hutch. I got sideways a little bit on a code enforcement issue because you alluded to my personality. My governing body gave me some marching orders on code enforcement. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I went out and did code enforcement.
Yes.
And the crazy part is, and I talked about this with Gavin from City Detect on a recent podcast just a couple of weeks ago I released.
Nice.
It's usually the worst offenders that are your biggest critics. They'll come, they'll lie to your face, they'll lie in public about what you're doing, they'll misrepresent everything that's going on. We all know that code enforcement bends over backwards to not give anybody tickets. We're just trying to get compliance, right?
That's right.
But it's always the worst of the worst that want to misrepresent or malign you and what have you. Anyway, long story short, I won. I in this particular situation, this thorny issue on Main Street, right? Literally our Main Street. I won. I was victorious, and I took a victory lap, and I was not ashamed of it. I was not embarrassed of it because this person was just an unsavory character, and so I got sideways with my counsel because they didn't like the fact that I took the victory lap, so to speak, right?
Okay.
And maybe I should have, whatever. But the reason why I'm bringing the story up is because there was some consternation about how I had handled it. And so there was a conversation in the closed session. And it was reported to me after the fact sometime later, basically one of the council members said, because I was making $100,000 at the time, right?
Yes.
And so, I had only a 6 month severance there. So they were asking, are you $50,000 mad? Because that's basically what we're asking. Are you $50,000 mad? Do we want to walk away from this guy right now?
It can come down to that.
That's right. And that's why, we talk about when it comes to severance, the importance of severance isn't also just to protect you financially in the case that you're separated. Yeah. It is to protect you against the capricious whims or actions of a counsel who might be reacting emotionally or in the moment of the various pressures that they're getting or what have you.
It's an accountability measure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's multiple reasons why you want to have a lengthy severance. It's not just because you want a quote unquote golden parachute.
Yeah. And if you're that concerned that you're hiring the wrong person, out of the gate as a manager, maybe do a little more due diligence. Maybe check some of the references a little harder. I've seen some of these modern day consultants, and I hate to say it because it may hurt me down the road, but a lot of them aren't doing the homework. They're just not doing it.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to share to the younger folks, or we cover it?
I think it's important that as an incoming applicant that you understand what the city's expectations are, of course, of you, but how are you going to be evaluated? What is that process? And in all of my prior cities, that process was very straightforward. I knew who was reviewing me, and normally it was done in their presence in executive session. And we talked about it, which I think is very constructive. And in this particular case, and I hope they've changed it for the sake of the new manager, I hope he doesn't have to deal with this, but they had a blindfolded basic evaluation process to where you didn't know who was evaluating you, but they could pretty much write anything down that they wanted. And you had no knowledge of what the circumstance or what the policy issue was. They didn't have to be specific. And that's hard to cure when somebody just wants to sling mud. And so I do hope that they've changed that for the sake of that new manager, but know what their process is when it comes to that. And be careful of resignations. If you're in a process and you've got a couple elected officials that aren't happy with you and they ask you to resign, think hard and fast on that before you accept that, thinking that that might be a viable option for you, because you lose a lot of rights when you do that. I was asked to do that at Hutchinson, and I refused it, and instead I asked for my right to cure, and that was refused as well. But had I resigned, I would have had no severance. I probably would have looked like I did something egregious that I didn't want the public to know about.
Right.
And now, today, as I sit here with you, Joe, I've got a settlement agreement that I can release to the public. It's not censored, and it pretty well shows the story as to what happened, and it puts me in a favorable light, and I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah. I do, it's I've talked to many city managers over the last couple of years, and it is, I get it from a human nature standpoint, because we all make decisions in emotional decisions, but so many managers will essentially cede their rights or walk away from a situation because they just want to be done with it and they want to close the book and go on and start fresh someplace else. And while that has merits, I get that to some degree.
True.
The reality is that in this environment that we're in now, especially with social media and how things can track you from one job to the next, like you have to fight aggressively to make sure you protect your reputation. You know, I had a conversation, a little sidebar here. Literally, I had this conversation on LinkedIn today, believe it or not, this morning, where, you know, there's this false equivalency between how city managers are being treated with hostility and whatnot. Because a lot of times, you know, I'm an advocate for city managers. And so it's very common for me to push back on how city managers are being treated and put out a city manager perspective. And then I'll have somebody in the comment section who will try to draw this false equivalency between the city manager and everybody else in the organization as if we're all equals, right? As if we all do the same, deal with the same stuff.
Right.
And no, that's not the way it works at all. That's not, no. there isn't, you know, how we're all treated the same and we all have to go through the same abuse. That we are scrutinized to such a degree as city managers, unlike almost any other position. And one of the points I made was I've never seen a management analyst or a maintenance worker leave city X and go to city Y and having social media comments being leveled against them or chasing them down or newspaper stories getting printed about, you know, what the conditions of or why they left their previous employer, right? But, you know, when you're a city manager and you go through situations, they can follow you to the ends of the earth, like, you know, the hounds of hell. They'll, you know, if you rub somebody the wrong way in your community, right, and you've really pissed off some people, they don't forget. Yeah. So, you know, you go look for a job someplace else, they're trying to plant seeds in a newspaper article or on social media and what have you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's very important that we as city managers in the profession, we got to be more aggressive about protecting our reputation because it's really the only thing we got.
That's right.
And it's so easy to lose. And once you lose it, how do you get it back?
Yeah, you know, we work long and hard to establish legitimacy to this profession.
Absolutely. Well, hey, Jeff, I appreciate you being on the show. I appreciate you driving down to visit me here in Wichita. We have our last kind of semi-warm day before we get another polar vortex coming through here.
That's right.
So I appreciate you coming down, doing my first in-person interview in my own home, and thank you very much.
Joe, it's a pleasure. Always been a pleasure.
All right, that will do it for us today. My guest has been Jeff Cantrell. He is the former city manager for Hutchinson, Kansas. Thank you again, Jeff, for all the hospitality and friendship you've shown me. Thank you for coming down and visiting me in my home and being this first in-person podcast. I'm looking forward to see what your next chapter is.
Joe, it's always a pleasure to work with you and to see you. I wish you well in the future, and to all those people out there that are attempting the same profession that we're in, all the best of luck, and don't give up.
Thank you, sir. I am Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast. If you are not aware, the American Association of Municipal Executives has recently launched a new job board. It is only for senior and executive level recruitment. So if you are looking for a job in the public sector, if you are a city manager or HR director doing an internal recruitment and you want to fill a senior level vacancy, go to jobs.aame.org. That's jobs.aame.org. Catch you next week.